I am here today to introduce HB 701-FN relative to a healthcare patient's right to try certain emergency healthcare treatment options. Simply put, the goal of this bill is to make New Hampshire the best jurisdiction in the country for clinical trials and, quote, right to try for people with life-threatening illnesses. With the advent of gene therapy, the world is witnessing a rise in innovative treatments for life-threatening and rare diseases. New Hampshire has a unique opportunity in this area, not only to help countless people in need, but to pursue a rare economic opportunity. Boston's biotech hub, where a large share of this innovation is happening, is 40 minutes from New Hampshire. If we establish ourselves as the most friendly and pioneering jurisdiction in America for experimental treatments for people with terminal illnesses, we have a truly unique opportunity to easily draw innovation and business into the state. I'd like to highlight 5 areas where this bill is different from our current right to try law. First is cutting-edge limitation on civil liability. Our current right to try law, RSA 126-Z, already limits regulatory enforcement actions against providers who give experimental treatments to consenting terminally ill patients. HB 701 will go further, allowing terminally ill patients to consent to a strong limitation on civil liability that will help them access experimental treatments. This will make New Hampshire competitive with Montana, which is now the leading right-to-try jurisdiction in the country and is unique in its civil liability limitations. The committee will receive extensive written testimony from people who were prepared to pay for right-to-try treatments for their own dying loved ones. The problem is that, even in so-called right-to-try states, the threat of civil liability, more than regulatory enforcement, almost completely deters manufacturers and providers from actually selling or granting experimental treatments to dying patients. Second, remote pre-screening for treatment. HB 701 would make New Hampshire the first state to recognize a state law right for providers physically present in New Hampshire to conduct a remote pre-screening for experimental treatment when a patient is dying. This would mitigate one of the largest logistical obstacles that dying patients around the country face in trying to access treatments, and could thereby attract significant business to New Hampshire from Boston and elsewhere. Although the bill says, quote, telehealth pre-screening, it's important to emphasize that a pre-screening interview is not the kind of, quote, healthcare we usually think of when we hear the word telehealth. A pre-screening is simply an initial meeting to determine whether a patient can apply to receive treatment. Many dying patients who want to access experimental treatment spend the last months of their lives physically flying around the country, primarily just to be rejected in various in-person pre-screening appointments. We should do everything possible under state law to make sure that at least these initial pre-screening appointments can happen in person. Third, remote signing of consent forms. This change is similar to the one just described, but in this case, the problem is that there are many cases of dying patients flying from one state to another simply to sign a consent form in the physical presence of a healthcare provider, even when they are not going to receive treatment on that trip. Fourth, a construction provision to help reassure providers and patients that may encounter additional, unforeseen regulatory or legal situations. We'll also add a broad construction provision stating that our purpose in passing this law is to incentivize providers and manufacturers to treat dying patients who want treatment, as well as to, quote, make New Hampshire a jurisdiction that attracts and fosters clinical trials and the development of drugs, biologics, and devices intended to treat life-threatening conditions. The law should always be interpreted consistently with this purpose. Fifth and last, a right to an injunction. Finally, the most important part of this bill and the piece that holds it all together is the right of a provider or patient to seek injunctive relief against a state regulatory or law enforcement authority that is obstructing their treatment. Under our current law, providers need to sit by, wait to see if a state licensing authority or agency will come after them, and then invoke our current law, 106-Z. as an affirmative defense. But the reality is this does not provide any cautious healthcare provider with the incentive they need to provide treatment. Instead, New Hampshire can offer providers from Boston who come up and set up shop in New Hampshire a unique degree of predictability and stability. By leading the country in this area, New Hampshire can both save numerous lives. Lives like Lucas Toro, a famous young muscular dystrophy patient who is undergoing successful gene therapy in Boston, and attract business and innovation to New Hampshire. On a last and personal note, after walking with my dad through his terminal diagnosis, with no potential life-saving options presented to or available to him, I strongly support protecting the rights of patients with terminal diagnoses to access potential life-saving or life-extending treatments. I urge this committee to stand with patients, their families, and the physicians who are trying to help extend their lives by ensuring that compassionate access to emergency treatments remains a protected right.